This is the hashtag CNF podcast, a conversation with writers and artists about creating works of nonfiction. I'm your host, Brendan O'Mara. This week I welcome Mary Heather Noble, an environmental writer who won Creative Nonfiction's Editor's Prize in issue 61's Learning from Nature edition. Her essay, Eulogy for an Owl, is a magnificent piece of writing, and particularly profound for me as it talks about moving out west from the East Coast and the latent guilt of leaving bitter family behind. And just so you know, the missus and I are totally down, but we received our fair share of guilt trips, which is particularly maddening, but that's neither here nor there. We're here to talk about Mary Heather's work and her approach. Some housekeeping. Share this episode with someone you think will get value from it. Subscribe if you haven't already. Leave a 5-star review in your directory of choice. All these things help a lot. Makes me feel good. So let's just dive in. Here's Mary Heather Noble. Thanks again for coming on the podcast. This is great. And congratulations for winning the Editor's Prize for your essay, Eulogy for an Owl.
Thank you.
Yeah, so first, in the blurb or that your little bio for the essay, it says that your writing is influenced by environmental issues by being a former environmental regulator, and wanted to start off by saying, like, what did that role entail, and then how did that start to inform a lot of the work that came afterwards?
Yeah, well, I worked as an environmental regulator for it was about 6 years, both in the states of New Mexico and Connecticut. And I would say that it kind of provides the lens for a lot of my work. So my work as an environmental scientist really does, it provides like a lens that, I look through for all of my writing in many ways.
So did you have a particular discipline as an environmental scientist, like wetlands or, arboreal stuff, or was it more all-encompassing?
Right. So when I started, I worked in permitting. Mm-hmm. I worked for the Groundwater Quality Bureau in New Mexico and their environment department. And there we were really focused on pollution prevention. And so I dealt with a variety of industries. We dealt with municipal wastewater treatment plants. We dealt with industrial operations like generating stations, mines. We dealt with agricultural operations. And so that was a lot of just regulating waste streams with the goal of protecting groundwater resources. And then when I moved to New Mexico and worked for the environment department there, my focus was more on investigation and remediation of contaminated sites. And so I've kind of had, the full gamut, if you will. I've looked at, prevention of pollution and then kind of the investigation and cleaning it up after the fact. And I would say most of my creative nonfiction pieces have really been more so influenced by my work in Connecticut, the kind of after the fact, the legacy of industrial operations and kind of, the silent messes underground, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah. My wife, when we lived in upstate New York, in Saratoga Springs area for a time, she worked for Ecology and Environment and in Arcadis, these two consulting firms. But she worked for a long time on the Superfund dredging site of the Hudson River for GE, that Superfund site. So she was very involved with that as the dredging started, up by the GE plant in Fort Edward.
Right.
So
right.
Yeah, so that's exactly what you're saying. Some of this in the PCBs there. So this legacy type stuff, this cleaning up of historic mess that took place decades ago.
Yeah, exactly. And I think for me, one of the things that I just kind of fixate on in my work is just the amount of time that it takes to recognize and address these problems. I mean, it's, generations go by before progress is really made. And there seems to be little regard for the generations that are potentially impacted. And so that's kind of a thing that I tend to focus on.
Yeah, I'm going to butcher the quote, and you see it all the time just in the practices of people. They're so short-sighted that they mistake that we inherit the earth instead of like borrowing it from the future.
Right.
Like it's that whole idea. There's just never any there's very little forward looking, especially if you're looking how the EPA has just been gutted and everything that's going on right now is just such a slap in the face to future generations and to the work that's come before it to just get some fundamental safeguards in place for safe air, clean water, and then it's just to see it erode away is just devastating.
There seems to be just all priorities placed on, short-term financial gain and just a general failure to recognize that we're kind of animals in the system too.
Yeah, it's a delicate web of interactions, and you also write about that too about in terms of conservation. What role do we play in helping preserve the populations of certain animals? Do you let nature play out, or do we meddle in it because our influence has so negatively affected them? So we actually have to maybe play a role in trying to balance the ecosystem. It's a fine balance. That's something I wanted to ask you about. We might as well just talk about that a little bit now.
Sure.
Because I think if I get the passage right here, it's sort of like midway through your essay. You say, of course, one of the goals of conservation biology is to preserve biodiversity within an ecosystem and make sure the health of the ecosystem is maintained so no species go extinct. But another, sometimes contradictory goal is to allow the system to evolve naturally, allow species to do what they would naturally do. So what is natural in this case? And, you also say like natural selection. And speak to that point of what that means exactly.
Yeah, so I think this idea of natural selection is that idea that conservation biology would preserve just kind of the natural tendency of evolution. It just allows species to kind of play out their competitiveness and just kind of let the process unfold without intervention. But given the influences that we have and our society has on other species, there is kind of this, I think, sense of, we've unfairly stacked the odds for one species over another, and therefore that's not really natural. It would be an unnatural natural selection. And so, maybe our moral obligation is to right that wrong and try to, put it back to put the picture back to the way it was. And I think, it really gets at the heart of whether people perceive themselves to be part of a natural system or not part of a natural system. And that is a difficult question to answer. I think that's kind of a philosophical question for a lot of people, whether or not we are in fact, animals in an environment, or whether or not we're somehow above it and simply influencing it or being the caretakers of it. And I don't know the answer to that. And it's just an interesting nuance that I like to circle around.
Yeah. So when you were thinking about before you got to the hard writing of Eulogy for an Owl, what was the hard thinking that went into it before you started drafting, and how did you come to this as something? Okay, all right, this is. I know. There's something here. I've got 3,000 to 4,000 words cooking. How did you start to approach it and think through it?
Well, I will say that I actually started this essay quite a long time ago when I was living in Bend. I've sort of a little obsession with owls.
They're cool animals.
They are cool animals. And, living up in the Pacific Northwest, just brings you really close to the spotted owl issues out there. And I'd had a couple of encounters just with great horned owls and things like that. So I actually started this essay years ago where there's sections in there, I think, where I've talked about the High Desert Museum, and it's they have they had spotted owl ambassadors there, and I actually had done the research about the Walt Disney part of the essay, and his eulogy for an owl and his story, or it was actually Paul Harvey's eulogy for an owl, talking about Walt Disney and his childhood encounter with an owl. And it was an essay that I was just fascinated by the subject. And it wasn't until I moved back east and encountered this owl, this barred owl, while just kind of walking in the woods, that the sort of emotional charge came to light for me. Before it was just kind of a creative nonfiction sort of research-based thing that didn't have any pow to it. It didn't really have a story behind it. It was just kind of a fascination for me. And then when I moved back east and I saw this owl, and it kind of made me pull the old piece out of the drawer and look at it again. I sort of realized, for me anyway, there were some parallels between my East-West kind of identity crisis and the story of barred owls and their westward migration, and the influence that westward migration has had on spotted owls and their population. And so it wasn't until many years after I had started the piece that I really saw the story behind it. It was more just information that I had accumulated and put into a drawer, and then had to resurrect after I found the emotional kernel in there.
Yeah, you touch upon a real important principle and theme when it comes to writing something that has a personal braid throughout the whole thing, and that becomes like distance from the piece and distance from the heart of it, to find the heart of it. So like
Right.
how important is that to maybe resist the urge to power through and maybe stick it in a drawer and then revisit it when you're like, oh yeah, there's that thing I was working on. Maybe make it more of a conscious thing and have that patience. Like, how important is that in a piece of writing, especially like this one?
Yeah, I think actually it's really important, and it is a lesson that has taken me a long time to learn. I think, when you're really interested in a topic, or, I tend to be motivated by, maybe it's an image that just fascinates me, or, I had this mentor in my graduate school program who talked about writers kind of sniffing around for ideas, like almost like a dog. You just sort of sniff around, and you're pulled in certain directions, and there is this compulsion to just kind of honor that attraction. And I think when you're interested in something, it is kind of hard to put it away, or you think, oh, this is so great. I just really, I have something here. And I think for me, one of the hardest things is knowing when you reach the limits of something, or maybe it's just kind of, it needs to rise like bread first before you can take it any further. Or you need to let it cool before you frost it, kind of thing.
Right.
So I think that for me has just taken some years of experience to figure out. And I think I kind of know that now, where I know not to throw writing away. I know to sort of just put it aside and hide it, and know that, eventually someday I may use pieces of that. So I think I'm recognizing, for me, writing is a little bit more like almost like quilt making, where you keep these other parts, and less like, materializing from thin air. It's, I tend to recycle things.
Yeah, like what's interesting. Kim Kankowitz, who was on a few episodes ago, and she won an essay contest in creative nonfiction in the Joy issue.
Yeah.
And what was really interesting about her essay, she had this essay kind of cooking around, and didn't quite know what to do with it, and didn't quite have the focus that she wanted. But as soon as she got the sort of the theme prompt from the magazine, it coalesced, and it, like, she was able to shoehorn it towards that one goal,
right.
and it, like, totally crystallized the focus, and it totally worked for her, and it worked out brilliantly. It's a beautiful essay, and she won the prize. And I wonder if something it maybe happened with the owl essay, or maybe it happened with something else. But do you find that an external prompt of that nature sometimes, like, oh yeah, I can take that, and now I can write to that prompt and make this thing something that I didn't envision at the very beginning?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that's definitely the case with this piece. It's interesting. I mean, I would say I had picked it up again after encountering the owl in the forest, but yeah, I would say, that it's definitely true that it works for me too, where a call for submissions will identify a theme or something that really kind of sparks and highlights an opportunity with a piece of work that I'd put away. And it's actually, I mean, that's one of the best feelings to, have this, like, oh, I have something for that. That I can resurrect and work on, and it just really energizes the work, and it's it's an opportunity to sort of rise to the challenge to see if you can make it fit, and that was definitely the case here.
Yeah, and so what was the process like as you were sort of working through this essay? How did you approach it, and what were those drafting sessions like, and the reworking, and what kind of notes did you receive? How did you approach it to get it from the point A to point Z?
Yeah, so I had a little bit of research. Basically, it was kind of like I had all these different clippings about owls, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
I had some research about spotted owl and the impact of the barred owl on the spotted owl population, and I kind of fleshed that out a little bit more. I had my own notes about just encounters I'd had with owls, and I had kind of the thread about how I felt about my east-west transitions. And really what I did is kind of look for points of this intersection between all the threads that I had in front of me. I really like to work with the braided form, and that kind of it's like I'll have like 5 or 3 or 4 different threads that seem relevant to the theme, and I'll see if there's connections between those threads, and figure out a way something can kind of naturally come together. In this piece, because the call for submissions and the theme for the issue was learning from nature, that was really for me the opportunity to kind of zoom out and look at conservation and the ethics of conservation from sort of a 10,000 foot level. That's what really for me kind of drove this particular piece, because that was really the element by which I could kind of shoehorn it into this particular theme. And so, it was initiated just by my own personal story and kind of my own personal dilemma. And I had, some of the research sort of in a drawer, so I pulled all that out. And then, and really ultimately it was the broader issue and the broader call for submissions and what we learned from nature that was kind of the driving force to enable me to put it all together.
And what did you feel that you did learn from this particular experience? Like, what was your big takeaway from this, from the interactions of the owls and that push and pull from the east and west?
For me personally, it's kind of like I've always kind of wanted to have control over a situation, and I think for me, the sort of takeaway was this relaxing into, like, I am as much a part of this system as these other elements, and there are factors that push and pull you in one way or another. And, for me, the kind of personal conclusion that I came to was that, our family made a decision to come back because, we felt like our connection to our broader family was kind of in danger. And given, my husband's circumstances with his job, we needed to make a change. And that's kind of what brought us back. And to sort of, draw the parallel to the natural world, I think there's just this, I don't really know what's going to happen, but I think there does need to be this acknowledgement that, we have this role, and we do have the influences over the natural world, and there is sort of a moral obligation, but I think there needs to be this recognition that, we are a part of this system too. And yeah, it's hard to articulate. I can't really say that, I have like a very clear takeaway message.
Maybe the brilliance and the great success of the essay you wrote was that it doesn't just answer things for you. It actually makes you question your space in the world. And so that in a lot of ways it's good tinder for these types of ethical conversations about conservation and what it means to be part or fractured from a family.
Right. Yeah. And I think, really for me, that gets to the heart of the thing. There is just a real disconnect. Certainly in my personal circumstance, there was a disconnect between us and our family. And I would argue that there's the same disconnect between us and our natural world. And, that's kind of, the thing that sort of struck me when I was researching this whole thing. I had researched and read this article written by a conservation biologist who talked about just the ethical dilemma of, having an owl in his crosshairs, and that it kind of went against every grain of his being to be in that position. And I think, that to me is sort of the beauty of it. Somebody who just recognizes his connection. And I think, most of us don't have that similar kind of depth of understanding of our connection to the natural world.
What was the moment, if you can pinpoint a moment or a watershed, if you will, of moments when you went from your environmental regulator life to wanting to become a writer and write about a lot of these experiences? What was going on in your head that you wanted to make that transition?
Yeah, I would say, so I've always wanted to write, and I guess I just regarded it more as a hobby for many years while I was working in the environmental sector. And then I took some time to have kids and raise them, and that really gave me the opportunity to resurrect my writing. And I really felt this calling to kind of sort of bear witness to the kind of work that I had done. I mean, I think, many people, it's certainly not like people don't understand Superfund sites or know that there's industrial contamination, but I don't think people really fully deeply understand just how pervasive it is and how common it is and how truly long it takes to fully investigate and understand a site and then even attempt to clean it up. And I think it's necessary for people to understand that if they're going to really protect resources and protect human health and the environment in the future. And so for me, it was kind of driven by this desire to share my technical experience and kind of what I'd seen behind the curtain, and figure out a way to do it in a manner that wasn't terribly boring. And so I like to write about sites that I've had, or things I've witnessed in my work as an environmental scientist, but try to weave it in a way where there's always kind of a human element. I think people like to read about other people. People like to read stories about people. And so I always try to focus on the human element of those experiences.
Yeah, that's it. Otherwise, you're just looking at like academic papers that just have these statistics and numbers. But like, if you can glom on a narrative component to it, now you're like this Sherpa, and you can really carry people through something that might seem esoteric or boring, very hard to get into, but it's just like what John McPhee has been writing about for 50 years. You know, a lot of stuff he writes is on the surface, you would say dull, but he engages with these critical people at the heart of a lot of these environmental issues, and then you can't help but be compelled by people trying to redirect the Mississippi River, or cool lava coming out of Iceland, or talk about oranges for 120 pages. It's
right.
Yeah, so it's like, yeah, you're exactly right. You need to like glom on that human element and how that reflects the environment. And you can really talk about some important stuff, but make it while making it very compelling.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think for me, I'm moved by things that grab me because of the impact they have on things that I care about. Right. And I would say, that's really kind of what drives the engine for me. If I may be intellectually interested in some environmental issue, but I'm not going to be motivated to write about it unless there's that emotional kernel. And I'll give you an example. Like, there's been a lot in the news lately about PFOA contamination in upstate New York and parts of southern Vermont, sort of a little region that was it part of the Teflon industry. You know, they created products, Teflon-related products, and there's this contaminant that has gotten into the water supply in some of these communities. And I had gone down to Hoosick Falls, New York, just to kind of, sniff around and see what interested me, see if there was anything that would compel me to write. And I stopped and went into their community center. And this is a community that is, had a very proud industrial legacy at one point, but is now kind of, in transition. And so the community had this, it was like a community redevelopment grant, and they had this whole theme of, instead of Hoosick Falls, it was Hoosick Rising. And so there was this attempt to sort of resurrect community pride. And I'd gone to the community center, and they had this tree in there that had little index cards hanging from it with things that they love about Hoosick Falls. I love Hoosick Falls because of this or that. And I looked at the cards on the tree, and there was one there that had been written by a little girl, and it said, "I heart Hoosick Falls because it has a great pool to swim in." Mm-hmm. And, I was there because of this water contamination, their public water supply. So this wasn't just an isolated well, this was their public water system. And so to see, a little kid express, her love and affection for this town because of this pool and the water, it just, it was something that just kind of got right to the heart of it for me. And it was almost like that moment in Erin Brockovich where the kids are swimming in the pool and they realize, like, oh my God, mm-hmm. This water's contaminated, get out of the pool. And, so that for me was one of those glimmers that really captured me because, you're looking now at a generation of kids. And what do kids do? They play in the water, they swim in the streams, and that just highlights their method of exposure, and it's very haunting.
Yeah. Can you point to any particular essays or authors that have informed and influenced the work you're doing now?
I would say, so I have kind of a couple of different groups of authors that I would say really influenced my work. Initially when I was really focused on kind of nature writing and environmental work, my sort of literary heartthrobs in that regard are...
I like that, literary heartthrobs.
That's actually a term one of my mentors used, and it was, something that we would have to come prepared to talk about at our workshops. Give a presentation on your literary heartthrob.
That's great.
So for me, one of my first ones was Terry Tempest Williams. I just really love the way she can write about a personal experience through a landscape. She was probably one of my earliest influences. I love Scott Russell Sanders and Sandra Steingraber. She definitely, for me, kind of has that Rachel Carson component and that ability to write about the sort of human impact of very technical things like contamination. Kathleen Dean Moore is another writer that I really adore. She's actually a philosophy professor out of Oregon State University and just has this incredible ability to kind of join human element, philosophy and environment. So that's those are the ones from the environmental sort of nature writing section of the bookstore. And then I find myself drawn to a number of essayists and memoirists as well. I really like people who have experimented with structure and form. So like Eulogy, Leslie Jameson, Leah Purpura, Joni Tevis are some essayists that I definitely gravitate toward. I will read pretty much anything written by Brian Doyle. Mm-hmm. Joan Wickersham and Abigail Thomas are a few memoirists that whose books I tend to go back to again and again, just because they've successfully written in fragments, and that's just something that really interests me from a structural perspective.
And is there, through all these writers, is there a commonality that you see among them that strikes such a chord with you personally, and like it just how those electrons just tend to align when you read someone? Like, have you noticed something among all of them that really just sparks every neuron in your brain?
I think I would say for all of them, the threads that are common to all of them are just this almost sensitivity and vulnerability. And they all just have this very quiet, very detailed power of observation. And I think that's probably why I'm drawn to all of those folks in particular. I really love the kind of distance of voice, but showing vulnerability in a story. That's just something that just kind of wins me over every time.
When you're starting to get into a project, or even maybe you're between projects, like what does your routine look like, or your morning routine, as you're trying to win the morning and then try to get some meaningful work done? Like, how do you win the day in that sense? And maybe that first hour to 90 minutes of your day, what does that typically look like?
Well, it sort of varies. I'm one of those writers that I kind of have spurts and dry spells. I think partially because I've got kids and, so I have to kind of work around that. A really good day for me is, I get the kids off to school. I come back to an empty house. I'm able to successfully avoid any distractions or temptations from looking at the news or anything like that and getting sucked into those rabbit holes. Ideally, I would have something that I've already kind of started. So I already have the clay on the wheel, if you will, mm-hmm. And can just kind of get into a quiet zone where, like, for example, let's say I've got a number of pieces, fragments, just kind of in a manuscript, and I can print it out and then start to really look for the points of intersection, so I can organize them. And, once I have sort of a general framework, then that's when I really try to enter the dream, and, go into the individual fragments and flesh them out. And then, it's almost like swimming, where it feels fluid, and I'm looking for that ideal, when you get to the end of the lane and you, you have that good turn and head back out. That's what I'm looking for in those intersections between fragments. So, and if I'm starting from scratch, I always need to write in my journal, pen and paper, the old-fashioned way. I can never just start on the computer. So that's where, I tend to have I need some outside influences for inspiration, whether, I'm just going to an art gallery or something just to get myself in the mood and then going off with my journal or, take a walk in the woods or something. I kind of need something to prime the pump, and then I can go and quietly just dream up some ideas.
Yeah, that's great. You touched upon so many cool things, like going to an art gallery. And sometimes I haven't asked this in a while, but I like to ask this of writers of like what other artistic media do you consume to help spark interest or inform sort of your bread and butter. So like going to an art gallery to help spark your writing. Like what kind of things like that do you indulge in to help your writing?
Yeah. It's interesting. I think it's a great question. And for me, when I first started to get into writing and take it seriously, it felt a little bit like cheating, like it didn't feel like part of the work. And it wasn't until I had gotten, I think it's called The Artist's Way by Julie.
Yeah. Yep.
Where this concept of making artist dates for yourself to kind of keep yourself well nourished. That was like the first, like, oh, no, this is actually part of the work and essential to it. So yeah, for me, I would say going to galleries, going on walks, just getting out in the natural world. Those are, it's almost like, it's meditative. It just, it's necessary for me for just decluttering the mind with the everyday mechanics. So I definitely do that. The other thing for me, honestly, is sometimes watching documentaries,
Yep.
watching films. That for me can be really inspiring. There's one in particular that I'm thinking of. I hope I can remember her name. The documentary was called Stories We Tell. Sarah was the director. Sarah, I'm kind of spacing on her last name. I believe it starts with a P. But the documentary is called Stories We Tell, and it's this wonderful documentary about the director herself and her family, and this story in her family about her mother, and in fact, who was the true identity of Sarah's father. So there's a story about infidelity, and the mother had passed away, and so anyway, the documentary itself was her interviewing all her different family members to get their versions of this family story, and then trying to kind of chase down the truth through those means. And it's just such an interesting study of different perspectives and how everybody remembers things differently. And so it was just, I feel like it should be a required element of every memoir class ever.
Yeah.
But that was really interesting and fruitful for me. So, if I can find documentaries that talk about storytelling or, certainly anything that highlights any environmental or social injustice, that will definitely kind of get my juices flowing too.
Yeah, there are some documentaries like I love are Jiro or Euro Dreams of Sushi. I don't know if you've heard. Have you seen that one?
Mm-mm.
Oh, it's so good. I've actually watched it like 6 times.
Really? I'm going to write that one down.
Yeah. Well, on the surface, it's just about, one of the world's, or maybe the world's most famous sushi chef, but it's really about the creative process and like just dedication to a craft and art.
Yeah.
And then also like the search for General Tso, about General Tso's chicken. But it's really about the Chinese American experience and surviving and the resiliency of the people who came over to this country and how they got a toehold in America through the Chinese food industry. Yeah. And it's just so brilliant that, they have these great little hooks, these titles that might suggest something different, but underneath it all, like any good piece of art, it means so much more.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, one of the things I just love about sort of studying documentary is just looking at how film approaches storytelling and kind of what what that can do to inform our work, and really, and the similarities between film and writing, or even, visual art and writing. It's just so interesting to look at that. I actually just spent a couple of weeks up at the Vermont Studio Center for a writing residency, and as part of that experience, you have the opportunity to go to open studios and really chat with all the visual artists that are there. And I had this conversation with this painter about the revision process. I was trying to just understand, like, how do you revise as a visual artist? What does that look like? And it was just very interesting. She talked about how they'll take she would take like a piece of tracing paper, or a big, sort of somewhat transparent piece of paper, and then, put it over her painting, and then literally cut out the parts of her painting on the tracing paper that she wanted to highlight, or, just a way of sort of looking at it to see, what if I bring this to light, or I put more emphasis on this part of the painting, or what if I cover this up? And it was just interesting to, hear that and think about, like, how is that similar to what I do as a writer when I'm playing around with my own work. So I really feel like all the different forms can inform, all the other different art forms can really inform our writing.
Do you have a process whereby, like, you sort of create a greater vocabulary? Like, do you log words that are cool and just kind of keep them stowed away and be like, oh, I can use this really neat word somewhere? Like, do you kind of geek out on the language and the words?
Gosh, I don't know. I've never thought of that before. I think I geek out more so on structure and metaphor, if you will. Like it could be, just a landscape thing, and I'll think to myself, gosh, that really resembles something in my life. Or, yeah, I tend to be more image driven than, certainly language is the form I'm working in, but for me, it's very much image. And then it's a matter of, finding the words to express whatever image I'm obsessing about.
Mm-hmm. And what does research, or what does your process of research look like? And how do you organize the stuff that you collect from wherever it is you get it, and before you sort of start writing? Like, what does that process look like?
Sometimes I will lose myself in the research, actually to the detriment of my work. Mm-hmm. That's an area that I do geek out on. And I think some of that is because of my scientific training. I feel like I've got to have the info, got to have the footnotes, even though they don't ultimately end up in the piece. I feel like I must have them. Yeah. So I feel like, often, let's say, for example, for this owl piece, I'll just have, some things that have interested me, like, oh gosh, I know there's a tension between the barred owl and the spotted owl population. Like, what exactly does that look like? And, when did barred owls start moving westward? And so I tend to disappear into online research for that. And really, I guess I would say it's almost like I have questions about the topic of interest, and then I have to figure out, well, how am I going to answer those questions, and where do I need to go to answer those questions? And so that will kind of take me to, the online resources or the library or what have you. And it can be somewhat of a rabbit hole, where I'll be in there and then I'll think, oh, well, look, that's really interesting. I wonder more about that. And I do have to sometimes reel myself back. Mm-hmm. But yeah, for me, it's kind of driven by this, like, what questions do I have about this topic, and where do I need to go to find them? And then ultimately, once I have that information, then I can kind of start to trim the fat a little bit and think, like, okay, so now what's relevant really to the emotional kernel here that I'm working on.
Yeah, Roy Peter Clark talks about a zero draft, which is like, it kind of gets you out of the the potential crutch of excessive research. It's like sometimes it's really easy to do like productive procrastination by
Yes.
just research, research, research. I just need one more thing, this, that. And he's like,
Yeah.
you know what? You can't be afraid to start early in what he calls a zero draft. Like you could be 75% what you deem enough research, but he's like, you should just start writing and then see what holes you may need to backfill at that point. Because at least you got to start doing the work at some point.
Yeah, exactly. It's difficult. And I have found myself where I'll have a piece pretty well structured, and some parts are really thoroughly researched, and some parts are just not. And then I've just got to lose myself in that.
And you referenced swimming earlier as kind of a metaphor, and that's kind of like a real perfect way to see the research or the creative process, because a lot of people try to get to a sense of flow and sort of being buoyed by the process. And if you're in a flow state in swimming, you feel just like buoyed by the water, supported by the water, and quiet and effortless. And
right.
I wonder how do you approach that? Like, how do you obtain that degree of flow in your writing or your research, and how do you define that, and what does that feel like to you?
For me, it's about consistency. So I'm kind of able to achieve that state if I have good long blocks of time, and certainly if I have several days in a row where I have good long blocks of time. I'm a big believer of kind of in the writing retreat, even if it's not something formalized like an actual writing residency, just getting away for a weekend and getting away from your everyday obligations so that you can really achieve a deeper state and really get yourself into the dream of your piece. For me, just because of my life, when I'm able to get away, I can achieve that. If I'm not, I tend to be a night owl. So, after the kids go to bed, I disappear into the basement. And I'm in a place where I'm not afraid to read my work out loud. I don't feel silly about it. It's just kind of a room of my own, if you will. And, I can read and reread something and really get into the rhythm, sort of the musical rhythm of the piece itself. And that's kind of the dream state for me. And certainly, when I'm able to actually even move myself, when I'm rereading a piece and kind of feel that emotion swell up in myself, that's when I know like I'm really in the zone.
Yeah. And are you like kind of a binge writer, or do you just take a little chunk each day? Some people can write for 3 to 5 hours straight, butt in the chair, and can just do that. Or are you more like you take maybe 45-minute bites and then a little break and then so forth? Like, how do you structure that generative process?
I'm not regular methodical. I just am not. It's, I have these moments of really productive time periods, and then I have dry spells. And so, I would say I'm more like a binge writer. Like when I'm productive, like it's for a good long time, and I sort of lose time. And I tend to be sort of a slow writer because I wish I could be better at this, just writing and generating material without editing. That is really difficult for me. I tend to edit as I go. And so it's very slow going. And so when I do finally get into a groove, it's a good long run. And then, if I have to take a break, I kind of can't wait to get back to it because I feel like I'm just in that zone and I don't want to lose it. I really envy people who have the discipline to just, get up and, get their writing in for 45 minutes and then go on about their day and actually, be productive over the long run. That's just not how it works for me. I really need to disappear into it and have the time and space to do it.
What does your query process and then look like in your submissions of essays and other articles? What does that look like? And then when the inevitable rejection comes in, how do you process that as well?
So for submissions, I this is going to sound kind of silly, but I often will use contest deadlines I'll use contest announcements as deadlines. Like that will get me motivated. Like, oh, I'll try for this. And I think partially because, when I got started, I had this real sort of anxiety about being in the slush pile. Mm-hmm. And I had, I sort of convinced myself, well, if it's a contest submission, then I'm guaranteed a look. And, so I have like a calendar in my office where I've written down a bunch of deadlines, and I'll have like a separate piece of paper where I have written down the particular contests or particular calls for submission, and write down what pieces I think that I have might fit for those. How we were talking about earlier, a call for submission often can be that thing that makes something gel. So, and then, I'll kind of just go by what my gut's telling me. If I'm really motivated by a particular theme or something that has been put out there, I'll work on that. And so I tend to do it that way. I'm a little bit less of a, pitching an idea in a query letter. I'm a little more motivated by, hey, we have this theme and we're asking for folks to submit. So it's almost like a backward process for me. It's not like I'm coming up with my own ideas.
Yeah.
And when I do get rejections, it's part of the process. I keep a sort of spreadsheet about where I've sent out and when I get my rejection, and then often I'll just kind of do the revolving door. I'll pitch it out to another place. But if I have gotten sort of rapid fire rejections on a particular piece, then I'll put it in a drawer. It's time to like really look at it. And every once in a while I'll get a very nice rejection that just is validating that, like, hey, this is a great piece, but it's just not fitting our editorial needs. And
you're not completely delusional.
Exactly. It just feels, it's kind of like the acceptance rejection, like, hey, it's not you, it's me.
Yeah.
Where you feel like, well, okay, so it's a good piece. It's just, I sent it to the wrong place. And I tend to look at my pieces like, a box of puppies that need to find homes. And often, it feels like, well, I've got to get them homes quickly before they lose their cuteness. But, but sometimes, people want that nice, well-behaved older dog, and it's just a matter of finding the right place for a particular piece.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, let's see. Before I let you get out of here, let me just ask you, where can people get more familiar with your work and find you online and all that good stuff? So if they listen to this, they can go find and read more about you and your work.
Yeah, sure. So I have a website. It's maryheathernoble.com. I also do have an author Facebook page. I'm not quite as active on that. My author website, I do have a blog that I attend to probably once, twice a month. And usually it's kind of a longer form where I tend to write about social or environmental issues, political issues, that sort of thing. So I've written about, for example, the PFO contamination in Hoosick Falls. And, it's just places where I can explore topics but not have to, it's a quicker turnaround than doing essays. So I do have connections to my publications there as well. I do have a Twitter account, although I'm not particularly active with it. That is at @NH_Noble. So I'm out there.
Cool. Very nice. Well, Mary Heather, thank you so much for stopping by the podcast. And this is a lot of fun talking shop with you, and I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for the opportunity, Brendan. Great to talk to you.
You too. Take care.
All right. You too.